The courtroom was silent before the gavel even fell. I sat on the hard bench, hands folded, the papers in front of me trembling just slightly. He smiled from across the room, like nothing had happened, like the truth was still his to control. Everyone assumed I was unprepared, that I wouldn't understand the system, that my quiet didn't mean I was paying attention. But I had already seen the cracks, the whispers, the files, the inconsistencies he thought no one noticed. And now, as the judge cleared her throat, I realized the risk wasn't in him anymore. The danger had been underestimated, and what was about to unfold would change everything. I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound as I moved through the kitchen, making tea. Everything was in its place, exactly as it should be. I liked it like that, predictable, controlled, quiet. Outside, the street was still empty, and I felt a strange comfort in its emptiness, as if the world had paused just for me. I sat at the table with my cup, the steam rising slowly, and looked at the stack of documents I had been keeping for weeks. Not because I feared anything, not yet. Just habit. I liked to know where everything was, who had said what, and when. Organization gave me a sense of stability, a way to anchor myself in a life that could otherwise feel fragile. He appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, the kind of smile that could disarm anyone. "You're up early," he said, voice light, almost teasing. I nodded, pretending not to notice the slight tension behind the words. Nothing in his tone betrayed malice, and yet there was something, an imperceptible pause, a glance toward the papers, that made my stomach tighten for a moment I didn't name. I let it go. That was how trust worked. You didn't let the small moments become mountains unless there was reason. We moved through the morning in silent choreography. Breakfast prepared, cups washed, the quiet punctuated only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I watched him as he moved, carefully noting details no one else would, how his hand lingered on the counter, how he avoided looking at certain papers. I filed it away as curiosity, harmless. After all, observation didn't always mean suspicion. The rhythm of the day was familiar. The commute, the soft hum of my office, the nods and polite greetings of colleagues. I had built my routine like a fortress. People assumed I was simple, easy to overlook. That was fine. Let them underestimate me. I preferred it. It made the world quieter, less cluttered with demands I didn't want to meet. I could focus on the small, precise details others ignored, and the world rewarded me with stability. Lunch came quietly, alone at my desk. A sandwich, some fruit, and the half-empty water bottle that had become a silent marker of time. I reviewed emails and reports, noting inconsistencies, small errors, things most would dismiss. My attention to detail wasn't about control, it was about seeing clearly. Seeing clearly meant fewer surprises, and fewer surprises meant I could navigate the day without friction. By late afternoon, he would send messages. Short, casual, nothing alarming. But I noticed patterns, times, wording, frequency. Not because I was paranoid, but because quiet observation had become instinct. I didn't act on it. I filed it mentally, part of the background hum of daily life. Trust didn't mean ignoring details. Trust meant holding them in balance until evidence outweighed assumption. Evening returned, slow and deliberate. The ritual of preparation, the soft lighting, the careful placement of objects. Dinner was simple. We spoke in low tones, voices measured. No raised hands, no laughter that carried too far. I noted what he didn't say as much as what he did. Conversations were small windows, and I leaned close enough to see the texture of truth without disturbing it. After dinner, I sat by the window. The street outside darkened, quiet again. I could see the faint outline of figures passing, shadows against the dim glow of street lamps. My mind wandered, not with fear, not with expectation, but with awareness. Everything I observed was catalogued, stored. In the normal world, trust existed in patterns, in consistency. And tonight, the patterns felt unbroken. I prepared for bed slowly, methodically. Every object returned to its place, every note filed, every document stacked. There was comfort in order, in routine. The house breathed around me, quiet and still. I felt a sense of stability I had grown accustomed to, the quiet assurance that nothing could shake me if I stayed observant. I closed my eyes, trusting the silence, trusting the routine, trusting him. And I didn't know that trust was already being tested, quietly, in ways that would only reveal themselves later. The next morning, the house felt different. Not loud, not chaotic, just off. I noticed it first in the small things. The coffee cup left on the counter, the newspaper shifted slightly from where I always placed it. I paused, hand hovering over the cup, listening. Nothing, just silence. I told myself it was nothing. That was the first rule. Don't overreact to small disturbances. He came into the kitchen, smiling as usual, but there was a hesitation in his eyes I couldn't name. I watched him move, careful not to let my gaze linger too long. He asked about my day, casual questions, but his tone carried a subtle edge I had not heard before. I noted it and filed it away. Observation, not accusation. Trust meant allowing small irregularities without judgment. By mid-morning, unease began to prick more insistently. Emails arrived out of sequence, files I had left untouched the day before were moved. My first instinct was to blame myself, to think I had misremembered, misplaced something. I told myself that was reasonable. Quiet reflection allowed me to differentiate between error and intrusion. Still, the pattern lingered at the edges of my awareness. During lunch, I spoke with a colleague in the kitchen. Their laughter felt slightly too loud, their attention too fleeting. I noticed glances exchanged between them when they thought I wasn't looking. I felt a flicker of discomfort, but let it pass. I reminded myself that imagination could fabricate small betrayals, and I had no proof. Observation required patience, not reaction. The afternoon was punctuated by a subtle tension that seemed to settle over everything. Files I had reviewed earlier contained minor discrepancies, nothing alarming but enough to register. He called me briefly, his voice casual, masking something in the pauses between words. I listened carefully, recording everything mentally. There was no panic, only quiet attentiveness. By evening, I found the first real anomaly in the documents I had been tracking. A signature slightly altered, a date that didn't match the sequence I remembered. It was minor, almost dismissible. Yet when I traced it back, I realized it might have implications I wasn't ready to name. I closed the folder slowly, letting the thought settle. The unease was growing, but I still held to trust. I reminded myself that early discomfort often had simple explanations. Dinner was silent. He moved around the kitchen with the same casual grace, but I caught a flicker of something in his expression when he thought I wasn't watching. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was anticipation, maybe. I noted it quietly. Trust meant noticing but not naming. It meant keeping the balance until evidence demanded clarity. Later, I checked the logs and records I kept meticulously. Something was off, but I couldn't yet say what. It was the kind of misalignment that made the mind itch without being able to scratch. I sat in the dim light of the living room, eyes on the files, ears tuned to the house. The normal world I had trusted felt subtly unsteady. Not broken, not shattered, just unsettled. Before bed, I paused by the window, looking out at the darkened street. Shadows moved differently than the night before. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in the familiar. I reminded myself that noticing details was not suspicion. It was awareness. I cataloged each irregularity mentally, storing them like stones in a jar. Tomorrow, the world might return to normal, and I would have a record to guide me. As I lay down, the quiet tension lingered. My mind traced the day's minor anomalies again, over and over without judgment. Trust had not been broken yet, but I felt the first fissures forming, tiny cracks I couldn't ignore. I closed my eyes, holding onto the routine, the order, the patterns. The normal world was still intact, just stretched. And beneath it all, I knew that discomfort, however small, was the first whisper of what was coming. The first hint that trust could be betrayed, that the quiet observation I relied upon might soon be the only weapon I had left. It started with a message. Small, casual, nothing alarming. But it was the kind of message he sent when he didn't want me to notice. The wording was off, the timing unusual. I didn't react. I read it once, then again, silently cataloging every detail. Observation, not confrontation. That was the only way to stay grounded. Later that morning, I found the first concrete inconsistency in the documents I monitored. A contract had been altered, just slightly, enough that it could pass unnoticed by anyone who glanced at it. But I had seen every iteration, every date, every signature. This one didn't fit. My stomach sank slightly, but I didn't panic. I filed it, noting the anomaly. The quiet weight of betrayal often arrives in small increments. By noon, the patterns became clearer. He had promised certain actions, arrangements that were suddenly absent or reversed. I asked casually, as if seeking clarification, and he smiled, dismissive. "You must be imagining things," he said. The words themselves were harmless, but the underlying implication, that I was untrustworthy, forgetful, incapable, was sharp. I made a note inside where no one could see it. During a routine meeting, a colleague mentioned a detail I hadn't known. Something minor, but when pieced together with the anomalies I had noticed, it formed a subtle line pointing toward intentional misdirection. I observed them carefully, their expressions, the way they avoided eye contact. I felt the first real chill of unease. Patterns were forming, and I could trace them if I remained silent. Back at my desk, I reviewed the records again. Everything aligned except for the sections I had highlighted. Someone had been manipulating details, just enough to remain unnoticed by others. I didn't speak. I didn't react. My quiet observation had turned into suspicion, but suspicion alone held no power. Power came from precision, from documentation, from the patient accumulation of truth. That evening, he called me from another room. The tone was casual, almost playful, but I noticed a subtle sharpness beneath it. He asked about the documents, feigned concern, and I replied carefully, masking my awareness. He didn't notice, or perhaps he did and chose to ignore it. Either way, the dynamic was shifting. I could feel it, quiet and unspoken. He was testing boundaries, and I was learning them. Dinner passed in measured silence. The subtle tension was palpable, though unspoken. I observed his gestures, the slight hesitation, the fleeting glance toward my files, the way he avoided answering certain questions. He assumed I was unaware, that my quiet meant passivity. He was wrong. I cataloged everything. Trust was eroding, but only I knew how. Later, alone in the living room, I traced the inconsistencies again. Each one was a small thread, seemingly innocuous, but together they formed a pattern that pointed toward a larger truth I was only beginning to see. The first red flags weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet, almost polite, like whispers in a room no one else could hear. But they existed, undeniable once recognized. Before bed, I walked slowly through the house, checking the usual points, the papers, the logs, the small details I had always tracked. Everything had subtle shifts. I didn't call them betrayals yet. I called them indicators. indicators that would grow, that would demand recognition, that would eventually force a confrontation I wasn't yet ready to have. I lay down and let the quiet accumulate around me, heavy but controlled. The normal world was fracturing, not dramatically, not obviously, but in ways that only a patient, observant mind could perceive. The first red flags had appeared. They were small, they were subtle, and they were impossible to ignore. The morning began like any other, but the air in the house felt heavier. I noticed it immediately. He had left the kitchen counter cluttered, papers out of place, the coffee cup not where it belonged. I didn't mention it. I cataloged it silently, as always. Observation first. Reaction later, if necessary. When I brought up a minor discrepancy in the files, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You're imagining things again," he said lightly, as though my careful attention to detail were a flaw. I didn't argue. I nodded and let the moment pass. That was how it began, small dismissals, almost invisible, designed to make me question my own perception. It worked slowly, subtly, like water eroding stone. By noon, the patterns were undeniable. Contracts, emails, agreements, they had all been altered. But when I presented the evidence quietly, he laughed softly, a gentle, almost comforting sound that carried no threat but a subtle message: doubt yourself. "Are you sure you looked at this correctly?" he asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not respond. I let him speak. Silence, in this case, was sharper than accusation. Colleagues began to notice the tension but misread it. "It's probably just stress," one said, voice low, half concerned. Another avoided my gaze entirely. I understood. My quiet nature made it easy for others to assume I was overreacting. That was the power imbalance I had always recognized but never named. I was underestimated, dismissed, quietly watched, but never truly heard. Throughout the day, small incidents piled up. A phone call I knew had occurred was denied. An agreement he had signed was claimed to be his idea alone. I found myself correcting details in my mind rather than in conversation. Correction aloud was dangerous. It drew attention, confrontation, and potential blame. Quiet restraint became my shield. Observation became my currency. In the late afternoon, he confronted me about a supposed mistake. The words were calm, almost neutral, but the implication was precise. I was careless, incompetent, unreliable. I remained silent, counting each pause, each subtle inflection. My mind cataloged the discrepancies, the evidence he couldn't see me holding. This was gaslighting. Not overt, not violent, but insidious, wrapped in civility and charm. The weight of it settled on me quietly, pressing against my chest without a sound. Dinner was another exercise in restraint. I noted what he didn't say, the omissions, the shifts in tone, the way he avoided certain topics. He assumed my quiet meant compliance. He assumed my observation had limits. He was wrong. I moved slowly through the meal, chewing deliberately, keeping my voice even, keeping my reactions measured. The smallest deviation might provoke confrontation, and I wasn't ready. Afterward, I retreated to the living room, documents in hand. I reviewed the day, replayed conversations, examined the files. Each denial, each dismissal, each subtle shift of blame was a thread weaving a web. He relied on the assumption that my quiet nature meant passivity, but quiet was not ignorance. I cataloged, I recorded, I prepared. Observation alone was not power, but it was the foundation for it. Late at night, I heard him moving in the other room, the soft murmur of a phone call, the faint rustle of papers. My attention sharpened. I noted the timing, the tone, the words I could hear. He believed no one was watching. I watched. He assumed control of the narrative. I held control of the evidence. The imbalance of power was subtle but present. Before sleep, I wrote notes, brief, careful, unemotional. Dates, times, inconsistencies, each one a small counterweight to his attempts to rewrite reality. I didn't speak, I did confront, I didn't react. I prepared. Restraint was not weakness. Restraint was clarity. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. He was in the next room, confident, comfortable, assured. And yet, beneath his calm, the first cracks had begun to form. The subtle, insidious gaslighting was meant to destabilize me, to make me doubt myself. But I held my quiet, my observation, my awareness. I knew the truth, even if no one else did. The day had been long, the psychological weight heavy, but I carried it without outward tremor. Emotional restraint, careful observation, quiet patience, these were my tools. The first waves of gaslighting had crashed over me. I had endured them, and I had cataloged every wave, every motion, every lie, every omission. Tomorrow, the pattern would continue. I would remain calm. I would remain silent. And I would continue to gather the evidence the world was too blind to see. The morning was colder than usual. I noticed it immediately. The chills seemed to seep through the walls, settling into the corners of the house, unnoticed by anyone else. I made tea and sat at the table, my eyes scanning the documents I had been collecting for weeks. Something had shifted overnight. The inconsistencies I had cataloged were no longer isolated. They were beginning to form patterns that demanded attention. It started with a simple email from a colleague, a misdirected message meant for him, but landing in my inbox. I read it slowly, word by word, noting the casual reference to arrangements that had never been disclosed to me. The message implied awareness, collusion, and manipulation. I did not react aloud. I did not speak. I placed it carefully on top of the files, the weight of evidence increasing silently, imperceptibly. Later that morning, a witness emerged without warning. A former assistant, cautious and hesitant, approached me with a hesitant smile. "I wasn't sure you'd want to hear this," they said, voice low. I listened quietly. Every detail, every omission, every intentional act of concealment was confirmed. They didn't have the full picture, but they had fragments enough to point in the same direction I had been quietly observing. The betrayal was real, not imagined, not subtle anymore. Real. By noon, I had cross-referenced the new information with my own records. A contract previously considered minor had been manipulated, signatures altered, dates shifted, actions misrepresented. The system I had trusted to maintain clarity had been weaponized against me. And yet, the evidence, though mounting, was still incomplete. Partial exposure, but enough to validate my unease, enough to confirm my suspicion. He noticed the shift in my attention, though he assumed he could mask it. Small gestures betrayed him, the slight pause when I moved a file, the flicker of an unreadable expression when I mentioned deadlines. He tried to smile to diffuse, but the cracks were already visible. His composure was fragile, balanced on the assumption that I remained unaware. I had been aware all along. Now the awareness had clarity, shape, and direction. In the afternoon, I reviewed additional communications, logs, and transactions. Every piece aligned with the fragments I had gathered from others. The partial exposure revealed a network of subtle manipulations, quiet deceptions, and deliberate omissions. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. And yet I said nothing aloud. There was no need. The evidence itself would speak when the time was right. By evening, the tension had thickened. He moved through the house with the same casual demeanor, but I watched, noting the micro-expressions, the half-formed gestures, the unspoken messages in his pauses. He believed he remained in control of perception. I cataloged every moment, every subtle slip. Observation was my armor, and evidence was my weapon. Patience had sharpened into precision. Dinner passed with careful civility. The partial exposure had altered the dynamic, though neither of us acknowledged it. He made conversation, but his words carried an edge I had learned to detect. I responded minimally, measured. I did not betray the knowledge I now held, but neither did I dismiss it. The quiet weight of understanding sat between us like a third presence, unspoken yet undeniable. Afterward, I returned to my desk and reviewed everything again. The fragments, once isolated, now began to interlock. Each witness, each misdirected email, each altered record was a piece of a larger puzzle. The pattern was emerging, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but with increasing clarity. I could see the scope of the betrayal, the extent of the manipulation. It was vast, yet fragile. I took a deep breath and made a note to myself: restraint, patience. The world was not ready for the truth yet. Partial exposure meant opportunity, but it also required caution. Any misstep could provoke defensive maneuvers, cover-ups, further gaslighting. I would let the evidence accumulate, let witnesses speak, let the system reveal itself. The quiet unraveling had begun, but the full reckoning was still to come. Before sleep, I placed the new documents with care, aligning them with my previous records. I traced each line, each connection, each omission. Partial exposure had illuminated the betrayal, but it had also revealed the stakes. The danger was no longer subtle, it was real. And yet I remained calm, observant, patient. Restraint was not weakness, it was preparation. I lay down in the dark, listening to the faint creaks of the house, the distant hum of the city beyond. The partial exposure had changed everything. He had assumed invisibility, assumed my quiet meant ignorance. He was wrong. I knew now that the truth was emerging slowly, like dawn across a darkened landscape. And when it fully revealed itself, it would not be dramatic. It would be quiet, inevitable, undeniable. The following morning, the tension in the house was tangible. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't announce itself with shouting or confrontation. It was in the subtle shifts of his movements, the slight tightening of his jaw when I passed by, the way he avoided certain glances. He had begun to sense that the partial exposure had changed the balance. He moved carefully, like someone trying not to wake a predator he couldn't see yet. I started the day by reviewing all new information. The witness statements, the misdirected communications, the altered records, all of it was now interlinked in a map only I could read. Each inconsistency, each omitted detail, each small lie contributed to a system of betrayal I had been piecing together for weeks. Observation had turned into strategy, but I remained restrained. Calm, controlled, that was essential. By mid-morning, I noticed his first direct reaction. A message I expected to arrive later in the day came hours earlier, terse and unusually formal. He was testing the waters, trying to gauge what I knew. I didn't reply immediately. I cataloged the tone, the timing, and the implications. Every word, every delay, every absence of explanation became data. He assumed control. I assumed patience. In the office, I observed colleagues reacting differently. Whispers had grown more frequent, eyes lingered longer when he passed by. Some had begun to question inconsistencies they had once dismissed. Small tremors of realization were spreading, subtle but undeniable. Power, I noted, was no longer entirely in his hands. Even without confrontation, the system was starting to betray him. That afternoon, he approached me directly. Calm, composed, his usual charm in place, but I noticed the micro-expressions, the fleeting tension beneath the surface. "I don't know why you're making such a fuss over this," he said. His tone implied superiority, dismissal, confidence, but I could see it cracking at the edges. He was testing, probing, trying to regain a sense of control. I responded quietly, measured, never raising my voice. I asked clarifying questions, citing facts, not accusations. I allowed the records, the communications, the witness accounts to do the talking. My restraint was deliberate. My silence carried weight. He flinched slightly at the precision of my words, though outwardly he maintained composure. The imbalance was shifting. Quietly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. Later, I discovered a series of transactions that contradicted the narrative he had been presenting. Minor manipulations, easily dismissed if viewed in isolation, but when connected to the larger framework of deception, undeniable. I traced each one carefully, marking notes in the margins, connecting dots that no one else could see yet. Every system he had thought under his control was now a source of evidence against him. By evening, the atmosphere was taut. He moved through the house as though stepping over invisible tripwires. His words were clipped, calculated, but I could sense the underlying tension. He was aware that I had gathered enough to see the pattern, but he did not yet know how much I understood. The escalation was quiet, systemic. It was in the control he thought he maintained but no longer fully possessed. Dinner passed without incident, but the conversation was measured, cautious. He asked questions I had no need to answer, statements designed to gauge my awareness. I nodded, replied minimally, never revealing the depth of understanding I now possessed. I watched him closely, noting how he paused when I mentioned certain topics, how he sidestepped others. The escalation was psychological, subtle yet precise. Afterward, I reviewed the files one last time before bed. The full scope of the betrayal had become clear. Partial exposure had revealed the framework, and escalation had shown me the cracks in his control. Each lie, each omission, each manipulation had consequences that were now inevitable. But I remained calm. I did not celebrate. I did not confront. I prepared. Observation, restraint, and patience would guide the next steps. I lay in bed listening to the faint sounds of the house, the shifting weight of movement, the soft hum of distant traffic. The escalation was complete. The stakes had risen, though nothing had been announced, nothing had been declared. The imbalance of power was no longer entirely his. The truth was advancing quietly, relentlessly, like a shadow moving across the floor. And I knew, finally, that the tipping point was near. Not through noise, not through confrontation, but through the systems, witnesses, and records I had gathered. The quiet, patient observation that others had dismissed for weeks was about to reveal consequences he could not ignore. He assumed control. I had been waiting, restrained, for the moment when the imbalance would shift fully, and soon it would. The morning light was pale, diffused through the curtains, but it did little to soften the weight in the house. I moved quietly, making tea, reviewing the latest set of documents I had compiled. Each page carried the story of deception, the evidence of lies, omissions, and manipulations that had been hidden for months. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was concrete, undeniable, and heavy. He appeared in the doorway, casual as ever, but the ease had faded. I noticed the subtle twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes avoided mine for a fraction of a second longer than usual. He had begun to sense that the balance had shifted. For weeks, he had assumed my quiet meant ignorance, but now he realized I had been observing, cataloging, and understanding far more than he anticipated. By late morning, the confrontation I had avoided for so long began to form, not in words, but in the quiet tension between us. He made a comment about a missing report, phrased as a question but with an edge of accusation. I remained calm, measured, and silent. I did not respond immediately. I allowed him to fill the space, to reveal his frustration and the cracks in his own composure. My restraint was deliberate. Emotional response would give him power. Quiet would take it away. I spent the afternoon cross-referencing every piece of evidence I had. Misaligned dates, altered records, misrepresented communications, all aligned with the fragments I had collected from witnesses. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was a clear, methodical map of betrayal, and with it came a profound realization. This wasn't just about him deceiving me. It was about the cost of that deception, the systems he had corrupted, and the people caught unknowingly in the center. He attempted to reassert control in the evening. He asked pointed questions, made subtle threats under the guise of casual conversation, and tried to insinuate that I had misunderstood everything. I listened. I observed. I did not respond with anger, not with words, not with action. The weight of restraint had become almost unbearable, but I recognized its value. I had the evidence. I had the witnesses. I had the records. I did not need confrontation. The moral weight pressed against me. Every time I cataloged a lie, every time I traced the ripple effect of his manipulations, I felt the cost, not just to myself, but to the quiet stability I had relied on. I realized that there would be no moment of dramatic reckoning, no opportunity for the kind of catharsis movies promise. The cost of truth was emotional, ethical, and deeply personal. I had to decide how much of myself I was willing to spend to see justice quietly unfold. Dinner was subdued. We spoke in measured tones, avoiding triggers, navigating around the minefield of knowledge I now carried. He assumed ignorance, I assumed patience. Neither of us spoke the full truth, but the weight of it was present in every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. I could feel the shift in the dynamic. He was cautious, wary, uncertain. I was quiet, controlled, resolute. Later, I sat alone with the documents. The realization settled fully. Restraint would be my weapon. Reaction would only feed the narrative he had tried to control. Observation, patience, and precision would ensure the truth prevailed, not through spectacle, but through evidence and consequence. I traced each connection again, noting the subtle patterns, the intentional manipulations, the overlooked witnesses. Every detail mattered. Every detail was power. By nightfall, I understood the full scope of the moral and emotional breaking point. This wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about exposing him for the satisfaction of seeing him falter. It was about bearing witness to the truth, about holding the system and the evidence together until they revealed themselves naturally. My breaking point was not surrender, it was acceptance. Acceptance that the betrayal was real, that the cost was heavy, and that restraint, not confrontation, would be the path forward. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the house quiet around me. He was in the next room, unaware of the depth of awareness I carried. I closed my eyes and allowed the realization to settle. The emotional cost was mine, the moral choice had been made, and the quiet patience I had cultivated would soon allow the consequences to unfold without fanfare. There would be no spectacle, no revenge, no dramatic moment of triumph. Only the inevitability of truth, quietly asserting itself. And I understood, fully, that restraint had become more than strategy. It had become survival. Observing, cataloging, and remaining emotionally controlled was not weakness. It was recognition. It was power. It was the only way to carry the weight of betrayal without being broken by it. The morning arrived with a muted stillness. The house carried a weight that wasn't there before, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been paying close attention. I moved through the rooms slowly, carefully, cataloging the atmosphere as much as the evidence I had compiled. The shift in balance was tangible. Systems, witnesses, and records, the quiet architecture of truth, were beginning to assert themselves. He appeared in the kitchen, polite but measured. The ease he once carried had fractured. I noticed the micro-expressions, the pauses in speech, the way his eyes flicked toward my files before returning to casual conversation. His awareness of my understanding was clear, and with it came a restrained tension. He could sense the consequences looming, though he still attempted to navigate as if he were in control. By mid-morning, the first tangible outcomes began to appear. An internal review had flagged inconsistencies I had long catalogued. Communications he had assumed hidden were now traced, recorded, and visible. Witnesses, once hesitant, now emboldened by fragments of truth, started to provide accounts that aligned with my observations. The network of deception was unraveling quietly but irreversibly. I watched, silently, as the reality he had attempted to manipulate began to catch up to him. There were no dramatic confrontations, no outbursts, no public spectacle. Just subtle acknowledgments. A colleague redirecting a question, a senior reviewing a document more carefully, the faint tightening of a meeting schedule to account for the previously concealed discrepancies. The consequences were systemic, methodical, and precise. In the afternoon, he attempted to intervene, to reassert control. His words were measured, but his tone carried the unmistakable tension of someone realizing their actions no longer dictate the outcome. I did not respond with anger, did not correct, did not assert. I remained observant, restrained, letting the systems I had relied upon reveal the truth. Every attempt to manipulate, every carefully phrased statement, only confirmed the breadth of exposure. The documents I had gathered, once just records and notes, now served as quiet witnesses. Each email, each signature, each inconsistency formed a lattice of evidence that could no longer be denied. The partial exposure and escalation had done their work. The consequences were manifesting naturally. Even as he tried to shape perception, the systems themselves were acting against him. By evening, the pattern of consequences was undeniable. Decisions he had made under the assumption of invisibility were being questioned. Small errors previously overlooked now demanded explanation. Witnesses, emboldened by the clarity of the emerging truth, provided details he could no longer dismiss. The imbalance of power, once fully his, had shifted irreversibly. He was no longer in control of the narrative. Dinner passed quietly. Conversation was minimal, cautious, measured. I spoke only when necessary, never revealing more than the situation required. He spoke less, carefully navigating around the evidence that now loomed over every interaction. The consequences were not dramatic. They were pervasive, threading through the fabric of everyday life, quietly establishing accountability. Later, alone, I reviewed the final pieces. Every detail was in its place, every witness accounted for, every discrepancy documented. The betrayal had been methodical. The consequences were now equally methodical. No one celebrated, no one yelled, no one made declarations. The truth had emerged, quietly, like dawn across a darkened landscape. Before sleep, I placed the documents carefully in order, aligning them with the chronology I had maintained. The consequences were real, unavoidable, and complete. He had assumed control, assumed invisibility, assumed that my quiet nature meant compliance. He had been wrong. The systems, the witnesses, the records, they had quietly, inevitably revealed the truth. And I understood, finally, that the resolution did not require spectacle or confrontation. The consequences had arrived exactly as they should, precise, silent, inescapable. Power, once held in arrogance, had been tempered by the quiet persistence of truth. I allowed myself a moment of quiet recognition, not triumph, not satisfaction, but acknowledgement that the weight of betrayal had shifted and the cost had been accounted for. The house was still. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, painting everything in pale shades of calm. The tension that had once seemed omnipresent had eased, not with drama, not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of truth asserting itself. The systems, the witnesses, the records, they had done their work. The consequences had settled where they belonged. He moved through the rooms carefully, aware now of the shift in balance but no longer panicked. There was no outburst, no confrontation, no attempt to reclaim control. The truth had become self-evident. He carried the subtle weight of accountability, though it was neither announced nor celebrated. I watched quietly, cataloging the small gestures, the fleeting hesitations, the acknowledgement he could not hide. I did not speak of victory. There was none. There was only clarity, the quiet confirmation that deception could no longer be sustained. I placed the documents neatly back in their folders, each one a silent testament to what had transpired. Observation, patience, and restraint had brought the truth into the open without spectacle. Outside, the street was calm. Shadows shifted lightly with the rising sun. I stepped to the window, watching the world continue as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had. No one celebrated, no one pronounced judgment, no one gained recognition. The aftermath was heavy, calm, and unadorned. I sat back, letting the silence fill the room. The betrayal, the gaslighting, the subtle manipulations, they were behind me now. The consequences had been delivered quietly, through systems, witnesses, and records, without spectacle, without confrontation. I had survived not through force, but through awareness, patience, and measured restraint. And in that quiet, I understood that this was the resolution life often offered. No applause, no revenge, no dramatic closure, only the steady, inevitable unfolding of truth, leaving its mark silently, persistently, and irrevocably.